Good evening. Um, My name is Tom Tamawa, and on the board of Strangers No Longer, and want to add my welcome to each of you who have joined us. Um, we have an important topic tonight, as Rich mentioned, and would like to. I'm glad that so many of you have joined us for this discussion. For those of you who may not be familiar with Strangers No Longer, um, for those of you, we're no longer, I'm sorry, let me start again. We're a growing network of circles of support connected to parishes and other communities. Our mission is simple: to protect the dignity of every single person with a focus on immigrant population. We do this by providing for their physical needs, by advocating for their social well-being and legal status, and by educating ourselves and others for the best way of doing that, which is what this is about tonight. So tonight we look at Catholic social teaching as a set of moral principles designed to guide our lives and decisions. Those tenets are particularly important at this time as we approach the country's national elections. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to spend a few minutes for the purpose of quieting our minds and perhaps uh, becoming a little closer to being able to listen uh, with our hearts. So to do this, I'm going to read a familiar gospel passage and then add a few thoughts. And then at the end of that, we'll take like a minute of silence for each of you to sit with the thoughts that may come up. This is the parable of the Good Samaritan. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit life, eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. When he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took 2 denarii and gave the innkeeper those two and said, look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Jesus said, which of these three do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So, as I said earlier, I was sitting with this parable, putting myself in the story. I decided to be present to it in two ways, just for the sake of seeing what we could get tonight. I imagined the Samaritan man who stopped to help. And then I took on the identity of the badly beaten, critically wounded Jewish man who was found by him. I wondered what they might have been what might have been going on between them, or what might happen between them. The Samaritan finds not only a stranger badly beaten and near death, but he must have immediately identified him as a Jew, and therefore, in that day, his enemy. Someone who, if they'd met in the same pathway, might have even had not even made eye contact. They probably would have passed without any sign of neighborly acknowledgement. And yet, this man looks at the person who would normally hold him in contempt and finds a rush of emotion, of pity, compassion, as he sees his total helplessness and suffering. Stopping to help undoubtedly meant delaying his trip and perhaps changing a scheduled plan. The very decision to stop and help inferred a respect for life that he had. He clearly held a deep sense of the dignity of the human person in his heart. So then I wondered if that badly beaten Jew regained consciousness in the presence of the Samaritan at that some point. What might he have thought as he looked around his surroundings, then perhaps into the eyes of the man who had given him aid? So I just held that for a moment in my mind, each of them looking into each other's eyes. So given that thought, so with that, I invite each of us here to each close our eyes for about 60 seconds and imagine the scene these two strangers from different worlds ponder at each other as they look at each other, eye to eye. You can take either person's view, be the Jew or the Samaritan, or even alternate between them, and see what thoughts and feelings come up as you put yourself in their place. At the end of the minute, I'll call us back and Rosemary can introduce Father Dave. So we reached 60 seconds, and hopefully you had time to sit with this and some thoughts and feelings have come up. Now I'd like to move on and introduce Rosemary for the next part of the program.
Thank you, Tom. And for those of you who are new, I'm Rosemary Inslee, and I'm also part of the Board of Directors for Strangers No Longer. I am pleased to introduce Father Dave Buersmeyer tonight, who's going to talk about how Catholic social teaching provides guidance for living. How does it help us form our consciences? Father Dave is a recently retired priest of the Archdiocese, and he's the chaplain for Strangers No Longer, as well as holding advanced degrees that really help inform his teaching. So we're going to do this interview style, and I hope that there will be questions along the way, and I invite you to put your questions in the chat. We're going to spend plenty of time after he talks to have him respond to questions. So, Father Dave.
Well, thank you, Rosemary. Good to be here. Watch all the names come on. They all, many of you I've met before, many of you, so thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to use the bishop's document, which is something that they publish every 4 years. called Forming Conscience for Faithful Citizenship. And as a jumping off point, and I'll add to it and kind of get into other than just what they have. But I think it's an important one that we should at least know about and use in our part of our formation of conscience as we prepare ourselves to vote. But before I get into that and into the kind of where does Catholic social teaching come from and what are the key principles, I want to spend just a couple minutes on conscience and the formation of conscience. So, Rich, I think there's a quote from Vatican II on conscience that would be worth putting on the screen. Yeah, keep it up. There you are. In the depths of one's conscience, a human being detects a law which he or she does not impose upon themselves, but which holds one to obedience, always summoning the person to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to one's heart. Do this, shun that. For a human being has in their heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of a human being. To obey it is the very dignity of a human being. According to it, the person will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a human being. There one is alone with God, whose voice echoes in one's depths. I raised the deeper understanding of conscience for us first because it's been my experience with voting and issues that surround voting is that many of us, and I fall prey to this myself, we come up with, we're adamant about where we stand, a particular candidate or particular issue, and that passion can be good. But what the wisdom of the church asks us to do is bring it into prayer and into a process of formation of conscience, allow ourselves to be challenged and really come to that inner core. Are we convinced that our approach, that what we're going to do, are we convinced that that is truly that voice of God to us that we must obey? Because ultimately then, it has to be a well-formed conscience, a mature, well-formed conscience, we're obligated to obey it. And this will come into some of the things in a few minutes, because sometimes we look at issues in terms of are they intrinsic evil or prudential judgments. And in the end, no matter where it comes from, it comes down to, is God asking us at the depths of our being to do what we're going to do? And so, conscience is a very, very important reality that I think can challenge all of us to not so quickly say, well, I know exactly what I'm doing and why I'm voting, and not just be negative about our voting, but to really struggle, be challenged, pray, and make sure that we're coming from the depths of our heart with what we're doing. So with conscience, it has to be well formed. And so, Rich, there's a little circle I'd like you to put on the board for that. There's nothing magical about this. It's just, this is very much off the See, Judge, Act kind of reality that many of us are familiar with. But conscience needs to be formed, and for that we need to be aware. We need to look. We need to be open to just the life around us and our own inner. We need to be open to our prejudices. We need to be open to ways in which we need to grow, and we need to bring it to prayer, and then we need to seek wisdom. Seek the wisdom of the church. The church has wisdom that comes from our tradition, wisdom of the magisterium, wisdom, moral wisdom, wisdom of teaching, doctrinal teaching. We need to bring that to prayer. And then ultimately it's up to us in the depths of our being to decide where it is that God is leading, what it is that God is leading us to do. But then before we act, we have to bring it to prayer. And then when we act, we need to trust then that the action we've done has come from a true process of forming a conscience well, and that we've done everything that God has asked us to do, everything that the church in its wisdom has asked us to do. But then we still pray, because I could go on with another quote from Vatican II that reminds us that just because it's a decision of your conscience or my conscience, it doesn't make it right universally. I can have a mistaken conscience and be following it as best I can, but it needs to maybe grow after I see the results of my action. So there's a kind of a continual circle of formation. And that's what I want us to do when it comes to really, even for something as the vote of the president, have we really brought that to this process of formation, of looking and praying and seeking wisdom and praying. We might have made a decision where we want to go and praying. And then when it comes time to do that ballot, even after that, continue to pray. That's then truly following conscience. Good. So now let's look at Catholic social.
Yeah, thanks, Father Dave. So I think our next question, or my next question is, backing up a little bit, you're bringing those principles from Catholic social teaching, to just say, tell us a little bit about what Catholic social teaching is and how it arose in the church.
Good, thanks. We have about a 135-year tradition now of Catholic social teaching. But the reason it rises in the Western world, especially, and in the modern world, at the time of kind of the Industrial Revolution and its after effects and its consequences. Up until then, well, let me do it this way very briefly. After what's called the Council of Trent in the 16th century, the Counter-Reformation, responding to the reformers, the church realized that we had to do better at forming priests. And so they focus on trying to help priests be good confessors. And so with that comes the concern for moral theology becomes, how can you define a sin, and how can you make sure that a person knows it's a sin, and what could be a good penance in conjunction with that sin. And so over time, a lot of moral theology gets focused on individual actions, not social reality, individual actions, and based on a norm or a law that was violated and has to do with just the individual. Well, that works a lot on a lot of things, and it's not a bad approach, because we all have to examine our hearts and deal with that. But what do you do with these bigger social questions? The world is changing. The economies are starting to go differently than anticipated. We're moving into much more of a capitalist economy. There's a backlash in terms of some Marxist socialist thinking, and so the church faced with all these social upheavals, and this is Pope Leo the 13th in 1891, that we need to have a way to respond not just to individual issues of moral theology, but these social issues, and bring church wisdom, bring church understanding, base it on the gospel and the long tradition. And so that is what allows the start of a tradition that we now come to call Catholic social teaching. I'm not sure why that particular thing is on the screen. We should not share that on the screen, guys. That's not, thank you. And so I would divide it into 4 phases, and then we can go, you can have another question for me. The first phase is starting with Pope Leo in the late 19th century, and it's really focused on local economies and national economies. It has to do with trying to make sure that Catholic workers don't feel a need to join kind of socialist movements in order to protect their rights, and a reminder to the owners and the ones who are driving the economy that they must treat workers with fair wages. Working conditions have to be better. You cannot have child labor. A reminder that you can join trade unions and so forth. So that is in the late 19th century, and first phase sort of is responding to these national issues. Pius XI will add to that in 40 years later in 1931. Then we get a big swell of documents from the popes and from the bishops that add to Catholic social teaching in the middle of middle to end of the 20th century. We have Pope John the 23rd. He issues an encyclical on peace. He issues an encyclical on the church's solicitude, Moderat Magistra, 1961. We have the amazing document from the Vatican Council called Gaudium et Spes that addresses these kind of social, economic, political, cultural issues, that we have a moral insights to give to people, and we want people to be recognizing that how we act in these arenas does form us. It forms us. There are moral consequences to what we do in these arenas. And so this begins in the second phase, less local, not just local and national economies, but a kind of a realizing we're in an interdependent world. This is the end of colonialism. The new nations are emerging. How do you develop them? There's a whole thing about underdevelopment versus developed, first world versus second and third world. And so that's kind of the second phase. The third phase of Catholic social teaching then really comes in with Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, where not only is it this kind of international look, but it's this global reality that it's not enough just to talk about underdeveloped nations. We realize that we have there's a solidarity across the globe. There's a concern then in terms of there's the breakdown of the East-West bloc, offering new opportunities. It's a hopeful era of Catholic social teaching, because it looks like there are real possibilities to have nations and movements come to a better kind of solidarity in terms of making this world more just, more peaceful. That's kind of the third phase. The fourth phase is I think starts with Pope Francis, because he reminds us that we sort of failed that moment of opportunity, and that we are now in a very troubled world. We're in a world of global crisis, a world of vast migrant and refugees, a world that has not conquered the issue of violence, a world that has to recognize that we have to find ways to come together, not in perfect ways, but starting where people are at. A world that gives more precedence even to those who are in need, and nations and people who are in need. So that just kind of gives you a quick framework within which, but because of these phases and going into those documents, you can pull out certain principles, and so that's really what comes to be called Catholic social teaching.
Thanks, Father Dave. And several people are chatting, and I'm hearing it myself. Your volume, your voice volume just went down. So, Jim, is there something that we can do with that?
I'll get closer to
Rich? Okay. For some, I'm not sure what's bringing it on.
Dave, just try. Yeah, we lost your volume a bit. Can you try to talk a little louder?
I've been talking pretty loudly. Is this enough?
That's good.
Let me try another microphone.
Well, what it sounded like to me was an internet bandwidth issue.
Oh, that could be my internet. Yeah, that's what it was. It was my internet band issue, which I can't do anything about. Sorry.
Okay. All right. We'll do our best. So then, seeing those core developments, Father Dave, what are the principles that are at the heart of Catholic social teaching?
To get to the heart of tonight, and then hopefully this will generate questions and discussion. So this long tradition, we now have 135 years. We can see kind of underlying this are certain foundation principles and auxiliary principles that can be brought out and examined, and that can then be used no matter what we're looking at, whether it's the issue of abortion, the issue of who we vote for, the issue of migration, the issue of taxation, the issue of whatever we're talking about. And so in 2005, actually, the Vatican congregation put together called the Compendium, they call it the doctrine, the social doctrine of the church. This is official teaching. This is doctrinal teaching. That's how much these principles have come together. And the U.S. bishops will use this document. They lay it out a little differently than the compendium does. I wanted to do it more directly from the compendium. So what I have here is sort of a summary of when the compendium goes into the principles. So 2 foundational principles: the dignity of every human being, and secondly, the common good. So they seem kind of like ho-hum, right? I mean, it's like, well, of course, we know what those are. We know what those are for sure. But let's just kind of go through them a little bit more detail. The human life is sacred. We know that. The dignity of the human person is the foundation of the moral vision for society. That comes from that bishop's document. And one way to kind of remind us of that are the three I do it under three words beginning with I. Human dignity is intrinsic. It's intrinsic. We don't earn it. We don't confer it on people. That's why, for example, we don't confer. We don't say, well, now we're going to decide that a fetus, an unborn child of 3 months now has the dignity of a human person. We don't confer it. Dignity comes from the first moment of life to the end of natural life. It's intrinsic to being human. We can't lose. And so it's inalienable. Second one, we can't lose it. Can't lose it. We could be the worst criminal in the world. We could be the laziest person in the world. We could be the most brilliant person in the world. It's inalienable. Again, it's intrinsic, and we can't lose it because it comes from God for us. And then thirdly, it's inviolable. There's no kind of quid pro quo saying, well, I could kind of violate or use a person's dignity to get to a certain end because that end is so important. Like I could go assassinate Putin because that will end the war in Russia and Ukraine. No. It's inviolable. You can't violate someone's dignity to get to a good end. And so the church has that as the foundational principle of all of its moral teaching, all of its Catholic social teaching, and it informs everything that it does. And we'll see there's a lot of areas that it gets applied to. The second is of the core principles is the common good. The idea of the common good, Pope John the 23rd kind of defined it first and then kind of has come from there. The common good is the sum total. I'm just going to read a definition and I'll talk about it. It's the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more easily and more fully. It can be understood as the social and community dimension of the moral good, the sum total of social conditions. One of the ways to look at it is that because we have this fundamental human dignity, what goes into that fundamental human dignity? To have that dignity sustained, we need to have life. We need to have food. We need to have water. We need to have education. We need to have access to healthcare. We need to have access to participate in communal things that affect us, and so forth. So there all those basic goods and needs and rights. There has to be basic access to them, and so the common good is when the least amongst us has sufficient access to all the goods necessary to protect and promote human dignity. When the least amongst us has sufficient access to the basic goods that will maintain everyone's fundamental human dignity. And so it's not a decision made by the majority. It's not just the greatest good for the greatest number. No, every human being has a right to basic access to these basic goods. So to help flesh that out, the compendium talks about some auxiliary principles. And one of them, again, is what they call the universal claim on all goods, leading to a preferential option for the poor and marginal. So in order to have access, that everyone has access to the minimum necessary to have fundamental human dignity, that means that all goods of the earth, food, water, money, our time, energy resources, health, shelter, everything, because it belongs to God. Everyone has a claim on it who does not have basic access to that. And so that leads the church to be a strong advocate for anyone on the margin or those who are not given basic access. That's why the church is a strong advocate for migrants, for refugees, for people who need health care, for people who the church is not against trying to offer families aid in terms of government aid and so forth that are on the margins of poverty, because it comes from that principle that the goods do not belong to me personally. I have a right to that private property, but it doesn't belong to me personally if there's somebody out there who does not have access to the minimum necessary to support their fundamental human dignity. But notice that also means that the church does not say that there's a maximum. In other words, people can become as wealthy as life allows them to be, as long as they understand that they need to be helping all people, especially those on the margin, have access. And then secondly, the principle of subsidiarity. The subsidiarity is the principle that tries to create meaningful participation for all. That if you can take care of a problem at a local level, you don't need to have someone higher up intervene. If you, for example, if the local community can handle education decisions better, then you don't need to have those local decisions surpassed by the state or the federal. Or the family can handle those decisions better. You don't need a local community to usurp the family's responsibility. We find this principle of subsidiarity in our country is a very, very challenging one. It's the one that probably creates the most tension in our country today. The most recent decision of overturning Roe v. Wade and Dobbs, where now it goes to the states to decide the kind of the framework for that whole issue of abortion rather than the federal government. Well, that's saying that it belongs to the states. But the other side of subsidiarity is that it's okay to have a higher level of intervention if there's too much chaos going at that local level. Parents have to intervene if the children of the family are somehow getting too chaotic in their choices. You don't let them do anything they want. The state has to intervene sometimes for local communities to have some kind of fair policies that all communities in the state will follow. Not the federal government has a role, and the church would say there's a role for the international community as well, so that nations don't think that they're the end all be all either. So there's a principle of subsidiarity that tries to help those who are most affected by decisions have a say in the decisions, but at times there also needs to be some intervention at a higher level. And finally, the principle of solidarity. And here the church is it's a virtue to kind of create solidarity with those different than us, but it's also solidarity means that there should be nothing from a moral point of view, that there should be nothing that is so divisive, that we cannot find a way to cross that barrier, at least in terms of listening to one another, even if we vehemently disagree with one another. And again, this is a very important principle because we're in a world and a country right now that is more and more being kind of divided, and people don't even want to hear the other people talk, or we assume we know exactly what they mean when they say certain things. And so the principle of solidarity says, no, if we allow that division to happen, it will not set up the conditions for the common good. But if we allow claim on our resources to help the most in need who are not getting access to basic goods, if we allow decisions to be made at the most local level possible, but understanding that some decisions have to be made at higher level, and if we work actively on solidarity, then the common good has a chance to emerge in our society.
Thanks, Father Dave. Yeah, thanks for that great explanation. So at this point, it might be really helpful for you to talk a bit about how Catholic social teaching helps us specifically approach issues of voting.
Yeah, okay, good. So this is where I want to be. I want to go into things, and then I hope it'll create a lot of conversation for the rest of the time. And Rich, for this one on the slides, I'm going to need a number of those slides where I have some of the statements from the bishop's document, because that's the ones that create. Yes, there you are. Thank you. So in their introductory note, every 4 years they add a new introductory note. Much of the body of the document is the same, or it's almost entirely the same, but the introductory note is different. While the bishops help form the laity in accordance with basic principles, they do not tell the laity to vote for particular candidates. On these often complex matters, it is the laity's responsibility to form their consciences and grow in the virtue of prudence, to approach the many and varied issues of the day with the mind of Christ. That's very important, right? So the church would be saying, we have this wisdom. We're even calling it Catholic social doctrine now, that we want you to understand. We want you to try to really embrace it. And then as you struggle with how that applies, I know I already saw in the chat room, there's a couple of questions about subsidiarity, that when you try to struggle with that, that try to find a way in which you can come to an understanding of these principles that is compatible with maintaining the fundamental dignity of every human being, and then also the common good, especially of those most poor or at the margin. But then once we've done that, then and form the conscience, well, that is our responsibility as individuals to then put that into practice in terms of how we vote, the community organizations we get involved with, the way in which we spend our money, and so forth. The next slide then. As Catholics, and this is from the document too, as Catholics, we are not single issue voters. A candidate's position on a single issue is not sufficient to guarantee a voter's support. Yet, if a candidate's position on a single issue promotes an intrinsically evil act, such as legal abortion, redefining marriage in a way that denies its essential meaning, or racist behavior, a voter may legitimately disqualify a candidate from receiving support. And in other parts of it, they'll go on to have talk about other intrinsically evil actions, torture, indiscriminate warfare, on and on and on. But the point here is, the invitation is we're not to be single issue voters, because when you're talking about social reality, social, economic, political, cultural reality, there are so many complex angles to that quite often it's not able to promote the common good just by aiming at one. Now, but rather we have to kind of take the totality in view. But then the next slide, please. So the next two slides, I'm not going to go through this. If you go into the document, part 2, they have all these areas that they say, these are all the areas we need to see how Catholic social teaching invites us to a very moral perspective on all these things. And it ranges from human life issues to promoting peace, marriage and family, preferential option for the poor. And then the next slide, even more. Healthcare, immigration, education, promoting justice, countering violence, care for creation, communication media, and global solidarity. So I'll invite you to just go to the document for that. But just to show you, when the bishops say we're not single issue, they then try to say these are the policy issues that Catholic social teaching can be applied to, and they are many and varied. The next slide, please. So remember, I said we're not single issue voters, but then the bishops also say there are some things we must never do as individuals or as society because they are always incompatible with love of God and neighbor. Such actions are so deeply flawed that they are always opposed to the authentic good of persons. These are called intrinsically evil actions. They must always be rejected and opposed and must never be supported or condoned. A prime example, and again, they use the intention of taking innocent life, and as in abortion and euthanasia. The next slide. A Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who takes a position in favor of an intrinsic evil, such as abortion or racism, if the voter's intent is to support that position. That's a very important clause. If the voter's intent is to support that evil position. In such cases, a Catholic would be guilty of formal cooperation in grave evil. At the same time, a voter should not use a candidate's opposition to an intrinsic evil to justify indifference or inattentiveness to other important moral issues involving human life and dignity. And they go on to use John Paul II and others to show it's not just the negative things, we're against this, we're against this, all the positive things we're in favor of. So there's a lot there to be looked at if you look at that document. Next slide. So I need to insert here now an important insight. The bishops have decided to use the term intrinsically evil acts in a way that can be confusing if you look at the moral tradition. In the FCFFC, Forming Conscience for Faithful Citizenship, they use it as a way to rank certain evils as greater than others, implying a more serious claim on our conscience. Because if it's a greater evil, then it has a more serious claim on our conscience. And at times they use it in an absolute way, but at other times in a less than absolute way. For example, when they're talking about euthanasia and abortion, it seems to be absolute. You know, this is intrinsic evil that cannot be against. And then they say, well, there's these other intrinsic evils that we ask you to seriously consider. So I would just kind of critique the bishops a little bit of the language there, because in our tradition, what intrinsically evil means is a shorthand way to summarize that the object of the action cannot be made good by any good intention or any extenuating circumstances. In other words, it's just a kind of a way to say there's no way to make this action good, because don't get, you can name any circumstance or any good intention, this action is always going to lead to moral harm. In and of itself, though, it does not indicate a seriousness level in our tradition. Lying is an intrinsically evil action. Spouses, you tell your partner you're going to go out and whatever, because you don't want them to know that you're going to go and have a dinner somewhere. You lie to them. That's an intrinsically evil action. I don't think it is raised to the question of though whether you want to make that the most serious level when it comes to voting on a particular issue. So in and of itself, intrinsically evil is not a gradation in our tradition of worse versus less worse. Actions that are not intrinsically evil then can be more or less serious than intrinsically evil ones. And this is where, again, the bishops, I think, could do a little bit better job, because it sometimes looks like under intrinsic evil, then, okay, we now know how to judge a candidate because they're in favor of something that's intrinsically evil. And some of the candidates are. I remember the Pope, did the Pope just say? the Pope just kind of dissed both candidates and said, oh, they're both evil, and so now you have to struggle with who's the lesser evil. But we can sometimes think that, okay, we know a candidate whether to critique them or to vote for them or against them because they're in favor of this intrinsic evil. And then we say, but then on these other issues that are not called intrinsic evils, like what should be the best border policy for immigrants? What should be in a pluralistic culture, what should be at least a stepping stone toward reducing abortion in terms of a reasonable law? What should be in terms of taxation? What should be a legitimate kind of progressive taxation that would be helping the common good? We don't call those, they're not intrinsic evil situations. And therefore, we can sometimes think, well, they're not that important. That's where I want to make us be very clear and go back to the idea on conscience. Remember, conscience means on all issues, not just intrinsically evil ones. We have brought it into our being. We have sought wisdom. We have prayed about it. We've agonized over it. We've come to peace with the decision. We still pray about it, and then we act on the basis of that. And at that moment of acting, it doesn't matter whether it was intrinsically evil versus not intrinsically evil. If it's wrong to do it, it's wrong to do it. And if it's right to do it, it's right to do it based on that conscience. Okay. I think that might be it until the next question, Rosemary. Rich, go up one more, see what my next slide would have been.
So we were going to talk a little bit more about the specific issues that guide voting more than others. So you started talking about that, Father Dave.
Yeah, and so this is, again, the bishops understand that there may be times when a Catholic who rejects a candidate's unacceptable position may decide to vote for that candidate for other morally grave reasons. And that's where the Pope was on his intervention a couple of days ago. Voting this way is permissible, would be permissible only for truly grave moral reasons, not just to advance narrow interests or partisan preferences or to ignore the fundamental moral evil. So, bishops as a whole, we are not single issue voters. We have dozens of important issues that Catholic social teaching can help us frame our mind properly toward. There are certain ones that are very important. And so when I talk about intrinsic evil, I'm not trying to say that the issue of protecting life is not of significant, it's of super importance. So I just wish the bishops used a little different language and didn't try to imply that other evil is somehow neither here nor there. So there are certain issues that are very important, and yet we have to kind of bring it all together with flawed candidates. For example, if you're talking about a candidate versus a policy issue, with flawed candidates who don't seem to embody all the virtue that in terms of how they approach moral issues that the Catholic wisdom would invite. And we have to take that into ourselves, we have to make sure we understand where they stand. So it means we have to be attentive and really seek proper understanding, truthful understanding of where they stand. We have to pray about it. And we have to kind of bring this together in whole so that which one, when we vote, let's say if it's a vote for a particular candidate, or some people might choose not to vote at all because the bishops say that could happen. Some people might come to a conscience-based decision. You can't vote because you consider both so flawed that you feel like you're participating in evil, whichever way you go. But most people will usually come to a vote for one or another, and it has to be based on that kind of total trying to understand which will bring about the better overall protection of the fundamental dignity of human beings as a whole, and which will bring about the better common good movement toward the common good. And that is where it takes that decision of conscience.
Oh, thank you so much. You've given us a lot. And we have now about 10 minutes
Good.
for anyone who would like to put a question in the chat. And there was one about subsidiarity around families making decisions versus a higher authority. Tom, maybe you can read the actual question.
Tom, you have to unmute yourself.
Our screen has disappeared.
Oh, all right. So there was a question that just came up, Father Dave, that says, is abortion intrinsically evil, even in the case of, say, rape or incest?
Again, if you're asking what the church's wisdom on that is, the church says there is no circumstances, even rape and incest, that would make abortion a morally, in and of itself, good action. Now, notice, and people can kind of get outraged by that, right? But notice what the church is trying to say by that. We need a society that would say that no matter how someone, even however someone got pregnant, we need to be in a society that can surround them with enough care, enough love, enough support that again, no judgment on them if they were to have an abortion. The church does not judge them subjectively. No judgment on them if they were to have an abortion, but would hopefully have so many resources and so much emotional support and community support that they would consider bearing that child to fruition and maybe wherever, raise it or adopt or whatever. Yes, the church would say that, and that's a very, very hard thing to understand. And it seems like, oh my goodness, but the church has no exception to that. That is the wisdom of the church. But notice what that is. It's not just an individual decision, right? We need to be in a society. We're nowhere near that kind of society that surrounds people with the proper resources, right? I mean, think of what a society would look like that would actually surround a woman who is struggling with that issue. And again, no judgment on the woman if she were to make a decision, or whoever's making a decision. But think about the kind of society that we would have. That'd be an amazing society. That's what the church is working for.
Okay. There's another question that came through the chat that you can respond to. Within the principles of subsidiarity, does the family or doctor supersede the state and federal government's involvement?
Okay, so I need probably a few more specifics about the context. I mean, the doctor and family generally, if you're talking about the health of a person, that has to do with the health of a person, that would reside with if they're underage, you'd want to bring in the parental or adult help to the underage child, right? If you're talking about then the issue of but again, if you're talking about changing transgender surgery, for example, no, the church would not say that it resides with just the individual, because that has a social effect as well. So I'd have to know more specifics, but generally, healthcare decisions reside with the mature person making their own decision of conscience, consulting their doctor after seeking the wisdom, including the wisdom of the church. And they might go against the wisdom of the church, but they should at least seek the wisdom of the church. It resides with them. But I want to leave it open depending on a different scenario.
Here's another. So, are you saying that abortion is intrinsically evil, even in the cases of rape
Yeah,
and
I said
incest?
that.
I'm
I
sorry, that
agree
was
with
not
that.
that. Given the recent denigration of the Haitian community in Springfield, Ohio, what can individuals do according to Catholic social teaching to mitigate the damage being done to the community?
Well, I mean, I would actually give that to the audience. I mean, you guys, everyone has kind of suggestions probably how to do that. I would say, yes, we should do something. We should send letters of support to that community. Maybe find community organizations like Strange No Longer in that area and help them or support them and say, what can we do to help you? We could look in our own communities and say, where are people being denigrated in our own community? So we absolutely should do things like that, because that absolutely is key to allowing Catholic social teaching to have an impact on society, and it's absolutely against moral teaching to that kind of denigration. It's just supposed to be.
Yeah, thank you.
And
There's one more question, Father, from Marco. And he's saying the document on faithful citizenship appears based in substantive issues, but says nothing about process, like whether a presidential candidate is willing to follow the law. And should we consider this as well? And if so, how?
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a great question. So I had to condense my slides, but if I can give me 1 second, because I have I can remember basically in that document itself. I don't know which paragraph it is. It talks about making a judgment in terms of candidates. And it says you must take into consideration their moral integrity, their character and their moral integrity do feed into your judgment about someone's ability. Because again, it has to do with implementing or leading, marshaling resources to promote fundamental dignity and the common good, right? So that's always the question. Who's going to marshal resources at the federal level, president or governor of a state or a senator or a local politician? Who's going to marshal resources best to overall protect fundamental human dignity, overall increase the ability to promote the common good? And the church says, the document says, as you consider that, you need to consider things like, are they in favor of intrinsic evil issues and stuff, but also goes on to say, and you need to consider their character and moral integrity.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Tom, is there another one in the chat?
yeah, and I'm not exactly sure of the meaning, so let me read it as it is and see where it goes. What about the church's proclamation of just war? Isn't that against the teaching of Jesus? Tom Gumbleton, Pax Christi, believe so.
Yeah, so that's exactly one of the neuralgic issues, right? Starting with especially John the 23rd and all the from there, John Paul I, John Paul II, Paul VI, John Paul I, Paul II, Benedict, and now Francis have really tried to agonize, saying we have got to get away from it, and have asked people to not use war. At the same time, we have this long tradition of just war teaching that the church is part of our moral tradition, and it's basically based on do you stand aside when someone is violating the dignity of another human being, and how far can you go if you intervene? It's one of those areas that the church is continuing to evolve, especially in a world that has weapons that are hard to use. It's not the old days where there's a duel between two people or something like that. One of the interesting parts of our tradition is Augustine. Augustine is one who started to advance what came to be called the just war theory, but he did that by asking the question that if someone wants to harm me, can I harm them back to protect myself? Augustine said, no, you have to let them kill you. He said, but what if someone was harming someone else? Can I intervene to have them stop that? Augustine said yes. So that was kind of the first wedge. By the time of the Middle Ages and Thomas Aquinas, they then said you can also use proportionate means. Hopefully you won't have to kill somebody, but you can use proportional means to protect yourself as well. And out of that will come some of the criteria for just war. But if you look at the criteria of just war, they are very strict criteria that are not easily covered by anything we're doing today. I don't, if anyone comes close to it, it would have been maybe the start of the Ukrainian Russian conflict where Ukraine had to respond to the incursion. But even there, now you begin to hear of problems within that war. So the popes have basically haven't denied just war, but have said war always leads to evil. We have to find a way to get out of it. So that's where we're at right now from the kind of official point of view.
Okay.
Right. Go ahead, Tom.
There's one more here that should be read. Could you advise the church's attitude on transgender individuals and our relationship to homosexuals in relation to the election?
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm not afraid. I'm glad that there are some good questions. So there are issues, there are areas that are new to the church, right? And the church does not handle new issues well in terms of it takes a long time for all the wisdom to kind of percolate up. I mean, one of the first things that percolated up with that whole area of homosexuality, the church finally got stronger at saying you cannot discriminate. You cannot use language against homosexuals. They have a fundamental dignity there. They have to be protected in their rights. You cannot violate their rights and so forth. But then it talked about an intrinsic disorder in some of its documents, as though they're something intrinsically from nature. And that many theologians have questioned that. A number of bishops have questioned that, but still it's in some of the documents. So it's still kind of trying to figure it out. The issue of marriage, gay marriage, the church just opposed anything, even civil unions said, no, you can't even have a civil recognition of that. But now you have a pope that says, if someone approaches you for a blessing, as long as it's not you're not doing the the official blessing of the marriage ritual of the church, an official blessing, you're allowed to, because you can bless anyone who asks you for a blessing. And by and large, many places, many bishops' conferences have acknowledged that civil unions have a place in their society that we have to at least recognize, and not necessarily say that we're not going to say them as sacramental, we're not going to bless them in the church, but we're going to have to at least recognize them as having potential good. And Pope himself has said there can be good in situations that don't follow all the church teaching. So that's where the church, now you take transgender, which is even more new, right? And so the church is struggling on how to do that, other than saying the ideal would be, the church does promote the ideal, saying fundamental dignity of every human being from the moment of natural conception. That would say we should have a society that would accept every child born, however they're born, intersex, homosexual, transsexual, transgender, but surround them with enough support and love and care and compassion and community support, let them know that they're welcome, that they don't feel like they need to physically change their bodies in order to come to terms with who they are in terms of their birth gender. That would be the present teaching of the church. And so the church would be very much not in favor of having hormone intervention at an early age and so forth. And so, but so new that the church is going to always sort of be a little bit behind it, but also reminding people in front of it, we're not there as a society. So yeah, we might not come across as the gurus of how to handle this, but we do know a society can do better at treating how we treat people and how we live with people. And that's where the church, I think, has a great, powerful wisdom to give, even if sometimes it seems to fall short on newer issues.
Thank you so much, Father Dave, for that. I'm seeing several people saying thank you for that nuanced explanation of these issues that sometimes get put out there as very simple and black and white. So, okay.
I do want to respond to. I understand that there will be many priests and who will say you have to vote one way. They might even say you're committing a sin if you don't vote a certain way. they are not speaking on behalf of the church. They're speaking on behalf of themselves. And so they shouldn't bring it into the liturgy or into a homily. They do, solidarity would say, try to understand their best intentions, but formation of conscience means that you don't have to bring it in and feel guilty about it or agonize about it. That you don't, they're simply sharing a wisdom that in the inappropriate context that they should not be doing, probably out of a desire because they have such a strong belief, and it's not a bad belief, right? I mean, that we have to protect innocent life. We have to protect innocent life. We do a lousy job of it in this country on so many levels, including the abortion level. We do. So they're probably coming from that perspective. But no, please don't let that become something that. Well, I hope it wouldn't get you to leave the church. I hope it wouldn't. It just simply out of solidarity, try to hear where they're coming from and go beyond that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate your nuanced approach a lot, and your solid teaching out of church documents and giving us a wider perspective. So now, Rich, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I believe there's somebody that's going to do a final announcement tonight.
Yeah, Bill O'Brien was going to give us a little couple words on the pilgrimage coming up. You're on there, Bill. We see you. You unmute yourself.
Well, just another word about Father Dave. Father Dave's going to be giving a presentation up in Gaylord Diocese on Saturday to, I know Amy's been working with parish leaders up there. So I think Amy's got 120, they've got about 120 people coming. So on Saturday. So thanks, Father Dave. Okay, so in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, probably 12 days, we're going to have September 29th, the Pope Francis has invited everybody to celebrate the International Day of Prayer for Migrants and Refugees. So I'm not sure exactly how we did it, but we are celebrating that at the cathedral on, I think hopefully everybody's gotten a flyer. When I think of what's going to happen there, that we're going to have multilingual, there'll be a beautiful offertory procession. There's a pilgrimage around the cathedral, a very, very brief, but beautiful. The high school kids are leading it. We ask you to bring your parish banner, so that if you have any kind of a parish banner or make one, have your grandchild make one. But the way I look at this, at the Mass starts at 3:30, everybody's gotten announcements. But the way I look at that is that this could be a really beautiful event that I wish my kids lived in Michigan. They don't go to church out in California. I wish they would be here in Michigan, because I think it'll be a beautiful example of some of the best in our Catholic tradition and our support for immigrants. So encourage you to come. Obviously, a wonderful turnout says something in Michigan. It says something about our church. It says something about neighborhood grassroots people in Michigan and the kind of society that we want, this kind of the kind of society we want here. So do anything you can to get the announcement out at church, to invite your friends, bring your grandkids. I think the Ugandan Catholic community of Michigan is going to have their choir and drums. The Lansing Cristo Rey choir is coming. The Guatemalan, if anybody knows anything about a marimba, St. Anne's music director is bringing over, the teenagers are going to play the marimba. It's going to be a beautiful celebration, and spread the word.
Hey, Bill,
Thank
just let them know too. If you go to strangersnolonger.org, right on our homepage, you'll see all kinds of information about the event, how to let us know you're coming. There's flyers there and more information. So strangersnolonger.org.
And you may know the pastor, the priest is going to lead the celebration. Anybody's ever heard of Father David Buersmeyer? He's going to be there. He's going to lead us, but I think we'll have some concelebrants and a lot of lay participation at all levels. So thank you very much, Rich. Thanks, Rosemary.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good night, everyone. And we're so glad you were able to join us tonight. And we do hope to see you on Sunday, the 29th.
Amen.